My paper examines the ontological security crisis that France faced as a war of the Algerian War of Independence. The Algerian War of Independence, in many senses, was an unusual war of decolonization because France did not lose the Algerian War in a conventional military sense. They objectively succeeded in pacifying the country, and the war was perfectly affordable for the French taxpayer. The failure of material explanations to explain why France left Algeria should push us to ask, well, then what did cause France to leave Algeria? I argue that it was a crisis of ontological security that in large part forced France out of Algeria. The reason that France faced a crisis of ontological security, which was marked by a deep sense of shame, existential anxiety, disorientation, a general feeling of being lost, was because the Algerian War, this was something that was done quite deliberately by the Algerian rebels, sort of shattered France's sense of self by taking two different narrative strands of French national identity, one of France as a Catholic European white country, and the other as of France as a liberal democratic power that was committed to spreading the values of Enlightenment liberalism around the world, and put those two narrative strands, which for decades, over a century, had endorsed France's presence in Algeria for their own reasons. All of a sudden, those narrative strands came apart. And it would either have to be that France would either integrate Algerian Muslims as full French citizens, or France would have to leave in order to preserve France's permanent status as a ethnically white majority country. Ultimately, as I show, France was unwilling to put up with the moral price of continuing to stay and the apartheid that would have ultimately been a necessary part of France remaining in Algeria. And instead, President Charles de Gaulle, who came back to power after well over a decade out of the French political scene, he came back to power and sort of helped narrate France's departure from Algeria in a way that reconciled these two strands. And this was something that he himself, as I show, was deeply concerned about, how to make France a liberal democratic country that would show that it was open to the rest of the world, but also making sure that it was still a fundamentally white European country. And ultimately, these two narrative strands of French identity that had previously, before France was forced to confront its bad faith in Algeria, these two strands came back together in favor of France's departure from Algeria. One thing that I hope to contribute through this paper is deepening our understanding of how ontological security works in regard to identity, particularly in the fact that national identities don't necessarily happen to have one dominant narrative, but often have sometimes two or more narratives that are in dialogue with one another, are intertwined, but are not necessarily the same thing. And countries like France that have a strong sort of universal component to them, where there's a universal identity of France as a liberal country, it's where the identity isn't defined by necessarily by race or language or religion, while you have another narrative that is very much defined by those exact same things. That in certain circumstances, like the Algerian War, can cause a lot of instability if those two strands are torn apart, which is what I show leads to the crisis of ontological security that France experienced in Algeria. Additionally, I want to help us understand what ontological security looks like in times of decolonization. Decolonization was a massive, massive change in power relations between peoples around the world. It resulted in a bunch of countries that had extensive colonial empires to shed their identities, their sort of role identities as colonial powers, and redefine themselves in a world where colonialism was no longer acceptable and empires were no longer sustainable. And how countries do that while still projecting a sense of security, maintaining a stable sense of self, is a question that I hope my paper helps answer. So if any of those things are interesting to you, I really encourage you to read the paper, and hopefully you find it as interesting to read as I found it a joy to write.